So now that you've seen all the secrets, hopefully this will seem a little less intimidating. Yes, it is a very complicated shape, but really I'm just going to do the same few things over and over. So let's go through how I would approach a truck like this. First off, I need to know the direction of the light, which I have here, and I've also indicated the ground plane. So the first thing I might just think about is, what if this were a very, very simple shape? What would the general planes look like? And that would give me kind of a nice starting point. I might use this and save it out as reference. But at some point, the next milestone I'm going to need to get to is the terminator. So before we were doing pretty simple objects, each one had a terminator, and then that allowed us to cast shadows. Well, here there's a bunch of smaller forms, but each one is going to have the exact same setup. Each one's going to have its own terminator, which is where the form becomes parallel to the light source. And if I can start by creating all those terminators and casting shadows, it'll be no problem. So as you can see here, I'm actually deviating a little bit because I'm painting this the way I would actually work. So in that case, what I'm doing is imagining where the terminator is and casting shadows. Now, that just comes from me spending a lot of time doing this. I've just had a lot of practice, so I skip around a little bit when I work. But I could not get to this place if I couldn't imagine where those terminators were. And also from a technical standpoint, I've actually separated these railings from the rest of the truck, which means here I'm painting and I don't have to worry about painting on top of the railings. But as you can see, I just go form by form and I'm casting shadows, and the shadows are going to be based on where is that terminator. So I'm not thinking at all about the full value range at this point. I'm just thinking about where does the shadow shape start and where is the shadow being cast. And I do that over every form in the object. It's not really all that challenging once you get the hang of it, it's just time consuming. You know, the secret is, once you get to this point, this is a lot like Basic Rendering 1. Yes, we were rendering a vase, and a vase is a lot more simple than a truck like this, but it's the exact same process. You're making a shadow shape in an illuminated form, and then you're just rendering it out. So my next step is going to be to add in the form shadows. These are going to be my soft shadows that help kind of round out the form. And generally speaking, these are done with a much bigger brush. I like to use airbrushes for this. And once you have those hard edge cast shadows in place, this step becomes really pretty simple. I just have to keep in mind where is the light coming from and what's the general value arrangement going to be. And from there, I just sort of fill in the form shadows. And then it's just a question of adding in shadow detail. So I haven't really talked about it too much in this series, but you'll remember from Basic Rendering 1 the idea of occlusion shadows. That's where there's sort of dark pools of shadow in the crevices of the form, because bounced light is not able to bounce in there and lighten it back up. So once again, here I will just focus on the areas that are in the shadow shape, and I'll just darken in those crevices. And I do the same principle across the entire model. Once again, not challenging, just time consuming. Now you might wonder at this point, why is there no cast shadow underneath the truck? Arguably I should have done that first. Once I had found all my terminators and began casting shadows, it's really a good idea to put in the major cast shadow of the form. It just helps ground an object. But because I wasn't really thinking too carefully when I made this example, I saved it for last. But the principle is exactly the same. I'm going to be projecting lines parallel to the light direction from the edges of the form until it intersects with the ground plane. Do this enough times and you have the shape of the shadow. Now here I'm kind of eyeballing it because, again, I've had a lot of practice with this, but the principle doesn't change. And since this is a sunlit scene, I'm going to have a pretty hard edge shadow, which I'll fill in with a pretty flat tone. And then I'll erase away where I don't need it, and there I've got my cast shadow. And once I've got all my major values in place, now it's just tweaking. So here I might use the levels adjustment to change the overall value arrangement. And then you start polishing. Then you continue polishing, and you keep polishing. Well, you know how it goes. You try and get rid of those lines, incorporate it into your painting, So you end up with something that just looks smoother. And this is exactly like we did in basic Photoshop rendering. It's just time consuming. But eventually you'll get to something that looks like this. And then I could take it a step further to change the local value of these objects. So here you can see that I applied the same rendering model to all the different shapes, but then some objects are going to be painted black, some might be gray, some might be white, and as a result they're going to have sort of a overall value shift. But from a shadow casting standpoint, you saw how I approached them all in the exact same way. So hopefully you can see that the truck here is not an impossible leap from our spheres and rectangles. I know I've said this 1,000 times on the site at this point, but work from simple to complex. It's not going to be easy to open the line work I've included for this truck and to just paint it right off the bat. I can't encourage strongly enough, do the homeworks, work with basic primitives. If you can really nail imaginary lighting on basic primitives, the leap to doing a truck like this one's going to be a lot easier. But if you just sort of theoretically understand how it works, you watched me do it and you kind of get it, you're not ready to do a complicated object. So start slow and then add more and more complicated objects once you feel comfortable. And once you're good at basic matte surface rendering from your imagination, you are going to be ready for the next video in the series, which is Basic Rendering 3, where we'll talk about complicated surface materials and different types of lighting. So stay tuned for that in the Control Paint store. And once again, thank you so much for supporting the site. It's a big deal. You're allowing me to keep making free videos for the library, which I think is incredibly important. And each of these videos that somebody buys allows me to keep this project going. So thanks for the help. And if you've got friends that might like digital painting, tell them about the site. Have fun painting, guys.